in the vast darkness between stars, where civilizations rise and fall like distant candles flickering in an endless night, there exists a truth that the galaxy's greatest minds refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes, the most dangerous predator is the one that learned to hunt, not for survival, but for sport. When the Vexi swarm began consuming entire star systems, the Galactic Council called upon their finest warriors, their most advanced technologies, their perfectly calculated battle strategies. They sent armies of genetically enhanced soldiers, fleets of ships powered by artificial suns, and AI systems capable of processing 1 million tactical scenarios per second. None of it mattered. The swarm didn't follow rules. It didn't negotiate. It simply consumed everything in its path, turning thriving worlds into lifeless husks within days. As panic spread through the galaxy's core worlds and refugee ships clogged every major hyperspace route, the Council made a desperate decision that would haunt them forever. They called upon humanity. Not the civilized humans who had joined the galactic community centuries ago, not the diplomats in their gleaming stations or the scientists in their research facilities. They called upon the humans that even other humans tried to forget. The ones who still remembered what their species had been before they learned to hide their teeth behind smiles. What the galaxy was about to discover was that humans hadn't evolved to be the perfect soldiers, the ideal strategists, or the most efficient killers. They had evolved to be something far more terrifying, the species that other apex predators crossed the street to avoid. Commander Zephyr of the Galactic Defense Corps stood before the emergency council session, his Sikh's arms trembling despite his efforts to maintain composure. The holographic display behind him showed red zones spreading across the galaxy map like an infection, each crimson mark representing a system lost to the Vexi swarm. Esteemed council members, Zephyr began, his translator working overtime to convert his species' complex tonal language into standard galactic. We have lost contact with the Kepler Defense Fleet. All 47 vessels, including the flagship Eternal Vigilance, have gone dark. Long-range sensors detect only debris and, he paused, mandibles clicking nervously, swarm biosignatures. The council chamber, a massive sphere that could hold representatives from over 300 species, fell into stunned silence. The Kepler fleet had been their most advanced military force, equipped with weapons that could crack moons and shields that had never been breached in 2 centuries of service. Ambassador Krell of the Tithonian Empire, his crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns, spoke first. How many systems have we lost this cycle? 17 confirmed consumed. 23 more under active assault. The swarm's expansion rate is increasing exponentially. Zephyr's voice carried the weight of civilizations dying as he spoke. From across the chamber, a deep rumble echoed as High Speaker Molak of the Ursine Confederacy rose to her full 3-meter height. Our battle clans have offered to lead the next assault. The children of the Great Bear do not flee from any enemy. With respect, High Speaker, interjected Dr. Vexilon, the insectoid chief of Galactic Military Strategy, your people's courage is legendary, but courage alone will not stop the swarm. We need a new approach, something the swarm hasn't encountered before. The debate that followed was predictable. Each species offered their traditional strengths. The Ursines their berserker fury, the Crystalline Collective their perfect coordination, the Aquatic Dominion their adaptive technology.
But every proposal fell apart under analysis.
The swarm had already demonstrated its ability to counter conventional warfare, absorbing and adapting to every tactic thrown against it. It was Ambassador Sarah Chen, the human representative, who finally broke the circular arguments with a single quiet question. Have you considered asymmetrical warfare? The chamber turned toward the small human delegation. Humans had been members of the Galactic Council for 300 years, but they were often overlooked. They weren't the strongest, fastest, or most intelligent species. Their technology was adequate but not exceptional. They served competently in support roles. Their diplomatic corps was respected, and their scientists made solid contributions to galactic knowledge. They were, in the minds of most council members, perfectly average. Ambassador Chen stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She was unremarkable by human standards, middle-aged, average height, wearing the simple blue uniform of the human diplomatic corps. But something in her dark eyes made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. The swarm adapts to direct confrontation, Chen continued, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite its softness. It learns from every battle, evolves countermeasures, becomes stronger. But adaptation requires patterns to analyze. What if there were no patterns? Explain, demanded General Thractos, the reptilian supreme commander of galactic forces. Every military in this galaxy follows doctrine, rules of engagement, tactical handbooks, codes of conduct. The swarm has learnt to predict and counter these approaches because they're logical, systematic, civilized. Chen's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but not all of humanity embraced civilization when we joined the galactic community. A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Most species had legends of their primitive ancestors, but those were ancient history, evolutionary stepping stones left far behind. Humans, however, had only been spacefaring for a few centuries. Their transformation from planet-bound primitives to galactic citizens was remarkably recent. Vex Alan's compound eyes focused on the human delegation. Are you suggesting we recruit from your species' less developed populations? I'm suggesting, Chen replied, that you stop thinking of warfare as a chess match and start thinking of it as a hunt. The silence that followed was different from before. Where previous pauses had been filled with despair or frustration, this carried a note of something darker. Fear perhaps, but not of the swarm. High Speaker Molak's keen nose twitched, and she studied the human ambassador with new attention. Her people were predators, but they were civilized predators. They fought with honor, followed codes, respected worthy opponents. The scent coming from the human delegation carried undertones that made her hackles rise, not the clean aggression of a warrior, but something more primitive and infinitely more dangerous. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Ambassador Krell, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics of caution. Chen activated her personal datapad, and the chamber's central display shifted to show a star chart of human space. But unlike the neat, organized territories shown on standard galactic maps, this one included regions marked in warning reds and blacks. These are the frontier worlds, Chen explained. Systems settled by humans who rejected galactic integration. They live as our ancestors did, in tribes, clans, hunting societies. The Galactic Council has always treated them as an embarrassment. Primitives we'd eventually civilize. But they've been fighting each other for 3 centuries in ways that would horrify this assembly. The display zoomed in on one particular system, showing a world of vast oceans dotted with volcanic islands. Skaregard Prime. Population, approximately 50 million. Government, none. Economy, survival of the fittest. Average lifespan, 30 to 7 standard years. Cause of death, violent in 83% of cases. General Thraktos hissed, his forked tongue tasting the air. These are your own people. How can you speak of them so? Clinically? Because, Shen replied, her voice carrying no emotion, they're exactly what we need. The frontier worlds aren't just populated by primitive humans. They're populated by humans who never stopped being apex predators. Humans who hunt other humans for sport. Humans who consider warfare an art form and violence a calling. She gestured, and the display showed orbital footage of what looked like massive hunting parties moving across alien landscapes. But these weren't hunting animals. The thermal signatures were clearly humanoid, and the hunters were tracking other humanoids through terrain that would challenge any species in the galaxy. The great hunt on Skaregard lasts an entire planetary year, Chen continued. 50 million people divided into tribes, clans, and individual hunters. No rules except survival. No weapons restrictions. No mercy for the weak. At the end of each cycle, roughly 10% of the population is dead. And the survivors are stronger, smarter, and more vicious than before. The chamber erupted in shocked voices as representatives processed what they were hearing. Ambassador Krell's crystalline form flickered with distressed patterns. This is barbarism. How has the galactic community allowed such savagery to continue? Chen's not-quite smile returned. Because we promised you that we could control them. We told you they were a minority, that they'd eventually be brought into civilized society. We've been very careful to ensure that the galactic community never learnt exactly what humanity was like before we met you. Dear Doctor, Vex Alan's wings buzzed nervously. What are you suggesting? That we recruit these primitives to fight the swarm? I'm suggesting, Chen said, that you've been fighting a predator with prey animal tactics. The swarm consumes everything in its path because nothing in this galaxy hunts the way humans hunt. Every other species fights to defend territory, resources, or ideology. Humans hunt for the pure joy of the chase. High Speaker Molak stood slowly, her massive frame casting shadows across the delegation seats. Human Ambassador, your proposal borders on madness. These frontier worlds you describe, they would be as dangerous to us as to the swarm. More dangerous, Chen agreed cheerfully. But that's the point. The swarm adapts to logical, predictable threats. How do you adapt to a predator that hunts you not for food, territory, or survival, but because it enjoys watching you run. The debate that followed was fierce and prolonged. Representatives argued about ethics, practicality, and the risks of unleashing what one delegate called a cure worse than the disease. But as reports continued to arrive of worlds falling to the swarm, the arguments grew quieter and more desperate. It was Commander Zephyr who finally posed the question that ended the discussion. How would we even approach these frontier worlds? If they're as violent as you describe, any diplomatic mission would be suicide, Chen finished. For anyone except humans. And not just any humans, humans they would respect. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. To recruit the hunters of the frontier worlds, the galactic community would need to send someone who could speak their language. Not the polite, diplomatic language of civilized space, but the older, bloodier language of predator recognizing predator. Chen touched her datapad again, and the central display showed a new image. It was a woman in her 30s, scarred and lean, with the kind of eyes that suggested she'd seen things that would drive most sentient beings insane. Her file listed 17 different military decorations, 12 psychological evaluations, and a recommendation for immediate psychiatric intervention. Colonel Marcus Rivera, Chen announced, retired from active service 5 years ago after what the military termed excessive enthusiasm during the Helix Nebula incident. She's from a frontier world originally, volunteered for military service to escape a death sentence, and has been living in isolation since her discharge. General Thraktos studied the file with growing unease. Her psychological profile suggests severe antisocial tendencies, possible psychopathy, and a complete disregard for conventional military doctrine. Exactly, Chen said. She's the perfect ambassador to the frontier worlds. They'll respect her because she's like them, a predator who chose to hunt for a cause rather than just for pleasure. The vote, when it finally came, was far from unanimous. Many delegates abstained, unwilling to take responsibility for what they feared they might be unleashing. But the tally was clear. The galactic community was desperate enough to try anything. 3 days later, Colonel Rivera stood in the same chamber where the decision had been made. She wore no uniform, carried no ceremonial weapons, and showed no deference to the assembled representatives. She looked like exactly what she was, a human-shaped predator temporarily wearing the mask of civilization. I understand you need hunters, Rivera said without preamble, her voice carrying the accent of the outer frontier. What's the pay? The question caught several delegates off guard. They'd expected patriotic speeches, noble declarations, at least some acknowledgement of the galaxy's desperate situation. Ambassador Chen answered for the council, whatever you want, within reason. This isn't about money, Colonel. This is about survival. Rivera's laugh was sharp and humorless. Everything's about survival, lady. Question is whose? She looked around the chamber, her gaze lingering on each delegation. You people spent 3 centuries telling yourselves that humans were harmless, that we'd become civilized, that the old ways were dead. Now you want us to go back to being monsters, because the civilized approach isn't working. General Thraktos rose to his full height, scales rustling with indignation. We are asking you to save civilization itself. No, Rivera corrected. You're asking me to convince the most dangerous humans alive to hunt something that's been eating your armies. There's a difference. She paused, studying the general with the same intensity a hawk might show a mouse. But I'll do it. Not for your civilization, not for your credits, but because the frontier worlds are in the swarm's path, and those people, savage as they are my people. The terms were negotiated quickly. Rivera would have complete autonomy in recruiting and organizing forces from the frontier worlds. No galactic oversight, no restrictions on methodology, and no questions about her methods. In exchange, she would coordinate with galactic forces to ensure that her hunters targeted the swarm rather than each other. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out, High Speaker Molak approached the human delegation. Her keen senses could detect the chemical signatures of various emotions, and what she smelled from Rivera was unlike anything she'd encountered in civilized space. Colonel Rivera, Molak said carefully, my people are warriors. We understand the necessity of violence in defense of our homes. But what you're proposing to unleash, are you certain it can be controlled? Rivera's smile was the most frightening expression Molak had ever seen on any predator's face. High Speaker, you're thinking about this all wrong. I'm not going to control them. I'm going to point them at the enemy and get out of the way. 2 weeks later, Rivera's modified courier ship, the Bloodhawk, dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Skaergard system. Long-range sensors immediately locked onto the vessel, and communication channels crackled with challenges in a dozen dialects of Old Human. Unknown vessel, you are entering sacred hunting grounds. State your business or prepare to be boarded. Rivera keyed her response personally, using the ritual phrases she'd learned as a child before the recruiting sergeants had offered her a choice between military service and execution. Blood calls to blood, hunter to hunter. I come seeking the greatest predators alive, for there is prey worthy of the hunt. The response came immediately, tinged with curiosity and suspicion. What prey could be worth interrupting the great hunt? Rivera's answer would echo across the frontier worlds for years to come, prey that fights back.
Within hours, representatives from 6 major clans had agreed to meet with her.
The location was neutral ground, a space station built from the bones of a long-dead Leviathan, orbiting Skyguard's smaller moon. Rivera arrived alone, as tradition demanded, carrying only the weapons she'd been born with. The meeting chamber was illuminated by open flames, and the air carried the scent of burning meat. Around a table made from a single massive vertebra sat the finest hunters humanity had produced. Clan chiefs, pack leaders, and individual predators whose reputations alone could clear systems. At the head of the table sat an elderly woman whose scars told stories of 100 hunts. Chief Bloodhawk of the Crimson Tide clan studied Rivera with eyes that had tracked prey across a dozen worlds. "You smell of civilization," Bloodhawk said without preamble, "but underneath you smell of the old ways." Explain. Rivera placed a data crystal on the bone table. When activated, it projected images of the swarm's victims, not the strategic overview the galactic community used, but ground-level footage of what happened to individual beings. The consumption was methodical, horrific, and complete. "They don't eat for survival," Rivera explained. "They don't hunt for sport. They consume everything because that's what they are. Perfect predators with no weakness, no fear, and no concept of individual identity." Chief Ironjaw of the Steel Fang clan, a mountain of a man whose augmented teeth gleamed in the firelight, laughed harshly. "Sounds like worthy prey. What's the catch?" "The catch," Rivera replied, "is that they've been winning. Every military in the galaxy has tried conventional tactics. The swarm adapts, learns, evolves countermeasures. They're not afraid because they've never encountered anything that could actually threaten them." Around the table, expressions shifted from skepticism to interest. These were humans who lived for the hunt, who measured their worth by the difficulty of their prey. The idea of hunting something that had defeated entire galactic armies was intoxicating. "What do you need from us?" asked Chief Shadowhawk, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the chamber. Rivera's answer was simple: "Everything you've got." The negotiation took 3 days, not because the terms were complex, but because establishing dominance hierarchies among apex predators was an art form that required patience and precision. Rivera had to prove she was worthy of leading the hunt without challenging the clan chief's authority over their own people. The solution, when it came, was elegant in its simplicity. This wouldn't be a unified human army under galactic command. It would be the greatest hunt in human history, with the swarm as the ultimate prey. Each clan would contribute their finest hunters, not as soldiers but as participants in a competition that would span the galaxy. By the end of the week, volunteers were arriving from across the frontier worlds. They came in ships that looked like they'd been built in scrapyards, carrying weapons that would horrify civilized beings, and wearing expressions that made hardened warriors step aside. Rivera stood in the Bloodhawk's observation deck, watching the growing fleet assemble. Ships arrived daily, some barely holding together, others sleek predators built for speed and stealth. Each carried hunters who had abandoned civilization's comforts for the pure joy of the chase. The communication officer, a young man whose clan tattoos covered every visible inch of skin, approached with a grin. "Colonel, we've got over 10,000 volunteers so far. Fleet strength is up to 200 vessels. And..." He paused, clearly pleased with himself. Chief Blackwater of the Ghost Clan just arrived with her entire pack. All 200 of them. Rivera nodded, unsurprised. The Ghost Clan were legendary, even among frontier worlders, hunters who specialized in infiltration, sabotage, and psychological warfare. If they were joining the hunt, word had spread to the deepest corners of human space. "Any word from the galactic forces?" Rivera asked. "They're requesting regular updates on our progress. Something about maintaining coordination and ensuring proper strategic alignment." The young man's tone made clear what he thought of such concepts. Rivera's laugh was sharp. "Tell them we'll coordinate with them when we're ready to coordinate." Until then, we're busy preparing for the greatest hunt in galactic history. As if summoned by her words, the communication array crackled with an incoming message from the Galactic Defense Corps. Commander Zephyth's image appeared on the main screen, his multiple arms gesturing frantically. Colonel Rivera, we need to discuss operational parameters. The Council is concerned about the lack of formal structure in your forces. There are no clear chains of command, no standardized equipment, no unified tactical doctrine. How do you expect to coordinate with our fleets? Rivera studied the alien commander for a moment before responding. Commander, you're still thinking like prey. You want predictable patterns, clear hierarchies, standardized responses. The swarm has learned to counter all of that. But without coordination, how will you function as a military unit? Zephyth's confusion was evident. We won't, Rivera replied simply. We're not a military unit. We're a pack of predators who've agreed on the same target. Each hunter will pursue the prey in their own way, using their own methods, following their own instincts. The swarm can adapt to your armies because armies are predictable. How does it adapt to chaos? The implications of her words hung in the space between them. Rivera was proposing to unleash not an army, but a hunting party composed of the most dangerous humans alive. No rules, no restraints, no mercy for anything that stood between them and their prey. Colonel, Zephyth said carefully, the Council specifically requested regular updates in coordination protocols. How am I to report your progress? Rivera's smile was pure predator. Tell them the hunters are gathering. Tell them the scent is fresh. And tell them that when we find the swarm, they'll know because the screaming will echo across hyperspace. With that, she cut the transmission and turned back to the growing fleet. In the distance, another ship was arriving, this one bearing the distinctive markings of the Deathwalker clan. Humans who had abandoned their original world after hunting it clean of all viable prey. The galaxy had asked for fighters. They were about to discover that they'd gotten something far more dangerous. Hunters who had been waiting their entire lives for prey worthy of their skills. The hunt was about to begin. The first contact between humanity's hunters and the Vexi swarm occurred 3 weeks later in the Theta Corvi system, where the swarm was methodically consuming the industrial world of New Sheffield. The planet's 12 billion inhabitants had been evacuated, leaving behind automated factories and mining operations that the swarm was converting into biomass with ruthless efficiency. Colonel Rivera watched the tactical display aboard the command vessel Reaper's Edge, borrowed from the Blood Moon clan. Unlike the sterile bridge of a galactic warship, this one had been decorated with trophies from successful hunts, alien skulls, energy weapon fragments, and what appeared to be the preserved claw of something very large and very dangerous. Swarm formations are holding standard consumption pattern, reported Tracker Voss, a pale woman whose augmented eyes could process electromagnetic spectrums invisible to baseline humans. 47 bioships in low orbit, supporting ground operations. Standard defensive posture suggests they're not expecting resistance. Rivera studied the swarm vessels through the ship's enhanced optics. They were massive things, clearly biological in origin, with surfaces that pulsed and writhed like living tissue. Intelligence reports described them as nearly indestructible, capable of regenerating from catastrophic damage and adapting to any weapon used against them. Perfect prey. Chief Bloodhawk, report, Rivera commanded. The elderly clan leader appeared on the communication screen, her scarred face split by a predatory grin. My scouts have been watching them for 6 hours. They're efficient, I'll give them that. But they're also predictable. Same flight patterns, same consumption sequences, same response times to external stimuli. From another screen, Chief Ironjaw's massive form loomed. My pack has identified 3 bioships that appear to be command nodes, larger than the others, positioned for optimal communication coverage. Take those out, and the local swarm loses coordination. Rivera nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. What about their adaptation capabilities? Intelligence says they learn from every encounter. Only if they survive the encounter, interjected a new voice. Chief Shadowhawk materialized on screen as if she'd been invisible moments before, her pale eyes reflecting the bridge's dim lighting. My ghosts have been monitoring their sensory arrays. They're scanning for conventional weapon signatures, energy patterns, formation movements, all the things civilized armies use. And what aren't they scanning for? Rivera asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Shadowhawk's smile was razor-thin. Individual biosignatures, emotional emissions, predatory intent. They're looking for armies and fleets, not hunters. The tactical implications were staggering. Every galactic military doctrine was based on coordination, standardization, and predictable patterns. The swarm had learned to counter these approaches by analyzing, adapting, and overwhelming conventional forces. But hunters operated on entirely different principles: individual initiative, emotional response, and the ability to improvise based on instinct rather than doctrine. All clan chiefs, this is Rivera. We're going in, but not as a fleet. Each pack chooses their own approach vector, their own timing, their own methodology. The only restriction is that we all hit them simultaneously. No coordination beyond the initial strike. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Across the hunting fleet, engines began warming up, and weapon systems activated. But unlike a military operation, there were no standardized procedures, no unified communication channels, no attempt to maintain formation integrity. Chief Bloodhawk's ships began moving first, using a technique Rivera had never seen before. Instead of approaching in formation, the vessels scattered like a pack of wolves, each following a different vector that would bring them to the target from multiple angles. Their ships looked primitive compared to galactic standards, but they moved with an organic fluidity that suggested years of hunting together. The Steel Fang clan took a more direct approach. Chief Ironjaw's massive vessels charged straight at the swarm formation, engines screaming and weapons already firing. It looked like a suicidal frontal assault, but Rivera could see the tactical wisdom. While the swarm focused on the obvious threat, the other clans could approach undetected. The Ghost clan, predictably, simply vanished. One moment their ships were visible on sensors, the next they'd faded into the background noise of space. Rivera knew they were still there, approaching through dimensions that most species couldn't even perceive, but tracking them was impossible. Colonel, Tracker Voss reported, her augmented eyes scanning multiple spectrums simultaneously. The swarm is responding. Bioships are shifting formation, preparing defensive measures. But, she paused, confusion evident in her voice. Their response patterns are inconsistent. Some ships are preparing for a fleet engagement, others are scanning for individual threats, and several appear to be doing nothing at all. Rivera grinned. The swarm's greatest strength was its ability to adapt to threats, but adaptation required consistent data, predictable patterns, and logical responses. What they were facing now was 40 different hunting packs, each with their own methodology, attacking from directions and using techniques that followed no galactic military doctrine. The first blood belonged to the Ghost clan. Rivera only realized they'd struck when 3 swarm bioships suddenly began convulsing, their organic hulls rupturing from within. Whatever the Ghosts had done, they'd managed to infiltrate the vessels and attack from inside. The dying ship's screams echoed across multiple frequencies, alien sounds of pain and confusion that made even the hardened hunters pause. Chief Ironjaw's pack hit the swarm line 30 seconds later. Their approach was the opposite of subtle. Massive kinetic rounds fired from distances that violated every space warfare treaty ever written. The shells were crude by galactic standards, essentially chunks of dense metal accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. But they struck with the force of small asteroids, and the swarm bioships hadn't adapted defenses for something so primitive yet devastatingly effective. The swarm's response was swift but confused. Some bioships launched organic fighters to engage Ironjaw's pack, while others began charging energy weapons to target the Ghost clan's last known positions. Several larger vessels started descending toward the planet's surface, apparently attempting to preserve their ground operations. That's when Chief Bloodhawk's pack struck from 4 different directions simultaneously. Rivera watched in fascination as the Crimson Tide clan demonstrated why they were considered the finest pack hunters in human space. Each ship moved independently, but their actions were coordinated by instinct and experience, rather than communication. They flowed around the swarm's defensive fire like water around stones, striking weak points with weapons that seemed almost random in their variety. "Colonel!" Voss called out, her voice tight with excitement. "The swarm bioships are showing signs of system failure." Not damage, actual confusion. Their adaptation protocols are trying to process 40 different threat types simultaneously. Rivera could see it in the tactical display. The swarm vessels were changing their configurations rapidly, trying to adapt to threats that kept shifting and evolving. Energy shields optimized for one attack were useless against the next. Defensive formations designed to counter pack tactics were vulnerable to individual hunters. Sensor arrays configured for detecting one type of approach were blind to the others. The swarm was experiencing something it had never encountered before. Adaptive overload. All packs, this is Rivera. They're confused, but not beaten. Time for Phase 2. Phase 2 was the nightmare scenario that the galactic military had never considered. Human hunters boarding enemy vessels while combat was still in progress. Across the battlefield, small craft launched from the hunting fleet. These weren't military shuttles or assault pods, but personal vehicles designed for one purpose: getting a hunter close enough to their prey to make the kill intimate. Some were barely more than engines with life support, while others were sophisticated stealth craft that could phase through solid matter. The swarm bioships, still reeling from the confusion of the external attack, had no protocols for dealing with boarding actions during active combat. Their organic hulls began sprouting entry ports and defensive appendages, but the adaptations were too slow. Human hunters were already inside, moving through alien corridors with the fluid precision of apex predators in their element. Rivera monitored the boarding actions through a hunter's personal communication arrays. The chatter was unlike anything in galactic military history. Not the disciplined reports of soldiers, but the excited calls of predators sharing information about particularly interesting prey. Hull breach on Deck 7. These corridors are designed for creatures twice our size. Advantage: us. Bioship is trying to seal my entry point. Cute. Cutting torch is making short work of the organic barriers. Found what looks like a nerve center. Local biosystems are responding to my presence. They're actually trying to digest me. Note to self: bring stronger acid-resistant gear next time. Chief Shadowhawk's voice cut through the chatter with characteristic calm. All ghosts, the bioships are networked. Neural connections between vessels. If we can access the network, she didn't need to finish the thought. Within minutes, reports began coming in of swarm bioships exhibiting erratic behavior. Some vessels stopped responding to external stimuli entirely, while others began attacking their own formation. The Ghost Clan had found a way to turn the swarm's greatest strength, their collective consciousness, against them. But the swarm was adapting. Bioships that had been boarded began sealing off infected sections, literally amputating parts of themselves to prevent the spread of human infiltration. Others started ejecting their organic mass in an attempt to flush out the borders. Rivera watched as one of Chief Ironjaw's hunters was launched into space when his target bioship purged its entire interior. The hunter's emergency suit activated, but he was now floating in the middle of active combat with no way to reach safety. That's when something happened that would be talked about in hunting circles for generations. Instead of writing off the floating hunter as a combat loss, 3 different clans simultaneously altered their attack patterns to create a rescue corridor. Not because of any communication or coordination, but because human pack instincts recognized one of their own in danger. The rescue was completed in under 90 seconds, with the hunter transferred to a Steel Fang vessel that then immediately rejoined the attack. The swarm bioships, observing this behavior, began adapting their tactics to account for human rescue instincts. They started using damaged vessels as bait, hoping to lure hunters into defensive formations that could be overwhelmed. It was a logical adaptation. It was also a fatal mistake. Human hunters, unlike military personnel, didn't have protocols for acceptable losses or strategic withdrawals. When the swarm tried to use their rescue instincts as a weakness, the hunters responded by becoming more aggressive, not more cautious. Every trap the swarm set only served to infuriate predators who considered such tactics an insult to their intelligence. Chief Bloodhawk's response to the swarm's bait tactics was to have her entire pack board the damaged vessel simultaneously, turning what was supposed to be a trap into the largest coordinated hunt in clan history. The bioship's internal structure became a hunting ground where 40 of humanity's finest predators pursued swarm organisms through passages that had never been designed for individual combat. The sounds that emerged from that bioship violated several galactic treaties regarding psychological warfare. Not the screams of the dying, but something worse: the sounds of predators enjoying themselves. Rivera checked the tactical display and felt a surge of satisfaction. In 3 hours of combat, the human hunters had destroyed or captured 31 of the 47 swarm bioships. More importantly, they'd done it without losing a single vessel or hunter. The swarm's adaptation protocols had been completely overwhelmed by the variety and unpredictability of human hunting techniques. All clan chiefs, this is Rivera. Outstanding work, but we're not done. The remaining bioships are trying to escape to hyperspace. No, came the immediate response from Chief Shadowhawk. Nothing escapes the hunt. What followed was a pursuit that violated every principle of space combat doctrine. Instead of forming pursuit formations or following standard intercept patterns, the human hunters scattered across multiple vectors, using techniques that seemed to ignore basic physics. Some ships accelerated beyond their rated specifications, pushing engines to failure points to catch fleeing prey. Others used gravity wells and stellar phenomena to create impossible intercept courses. The final swarm bioship was cornered 3 astronomical units from the primary star by a single hunter from the Deathwalker clan. The pilot, a woman known only as Rage, had modified her ship's engines to the point where it was essentially a guided missile with a life support system. When the bioship tried to enter hyperspace, she rammed it at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface. Rivera sat back in her command chair, watching as the last traces of swarm biomatter were vaporized by stellar radiation. Around her, the bridge crew was celebrating with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for successful mating rituals or particularly good meals. "Tracker Voss," Rivera called out. "What's our status?" "All swarm vessels destroyed. No human casualties. 47 bioships eliminated in under 4 hours." And Voss paused, her augmented eyes processing data streams. "The planet's automated systems are reporting that all swarm ground organisms have gone inactive. Looks like destroying the bioship severed their connection to the collective consciousness." Rivera nodded, unsurprised. The swarm's greatest weakness was the same as its greatest strength. They were so interconnected that destroying the control nodes paralyzed the entire local population. Her communication array activated, showing incoming messages from the Galactic Defense Corps. Commander Zephyr's image appeared, his multiple arms gesturing, in what Rivera had learned was a sign of extreme agitation. "Colonel Rivera, we've been monitoring the engagement. Your tactics were unprecedented. The swarm adaptation protocols appear to have suffered complete failure. How is this possible?" Rivera smiled, the expression carrying all the satisfaction of a successful hunt. "Commander, the swarm spent centuries learning to counter armies, but nobody's ever hunted them before. But the casualty reports, no losses? Against a force that destroyed the Kepler fleet? The Kepler fleet fought like civilized beings. They followed doctrine, maintained formations, and tried to minimize casualties. We hunted like humans. We followed instinct, improvised constantly, and considered casualties an insult to our skills." Rivera paused, letting the implications sink in. "The swarm can adapt to anything logical, predictable, or civilized. How do you adapt to controlled chaos?" Zephyr's mandibles clicked nervously. "Colonel, the Council requires a detailed after-action report. Strategic analysis, tactical breakdowns, casualty assessments. Tell the Council they'll get their report when we're done hunting." Rivera cut the transmission and turned to address the bridge. "All clans, prepare for hyperspace transit. Intelligence reports indicate the next swarm concentration is in the Vega sector. 23 bioships currently consuming the mining colonies. Around the bridge, predatory grins spread across scarred faces. The hunters of humanity had tasted swarm blood and found it good. More importantly, they'd discovered that their prey was not the unstoppable force the galaxy believed it to be. As the human fleet prepared to jump to their next hunting ground, word of the victory began spreading across galactic communication networks. The impossible had happened. The swarm had been not just defeated, but completely destroyed with no friendly losses. In the halls of power across the galaxy, a new understanding began to dawn. The humans had not sent their military to fight the swarm. They had not deployed their most advanced technology or their finest strategic minds. They had simply unleashed their predators on prey that had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. The galaxy was about to learn that there were worse things than unstoppable alien swarms. There were humans who considered such swarms an interesting challenge and a worthy test of their hunting skills. Chief Bloodhawk's final transmission before the fleet jumped to hyperspace would be remembered in human space for centuries. The prey runs. The pack follows. Let the hunt begin. 23 systems away, swarm bioships continued their methodical consumption of mining worlds, unaware that something was coming for them, something that hunted not for survival, territory, or resources, but for the pure joy of the chase, something that the galaxy had tried very hard to forget existed. The hunters were coming, and they were hungry. 6 months after the first encounter, the war between humanity's hunters and the Vex High Swarm had transformed from a desperate defense into something that made the galaxy's leaders wake up screaming. The hunters were winning. Not just winning, but dominating, with a thoroughness that violated every principle of warfare the galactic community understood. 17 major swarm concentrations had been eliminated, 49 systems liberated, and over 300 swarm bioships destroyed, all with 0 human casualties. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was what the hunters were doing to their prey. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of the Galactic Command Station Unity's Hope, watching intelligence footage that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The screen showed the aftermath of what the hunters called the Cygnus festivities. The complete elimination of a swarm hive world that had been consuming star systems for over a century. The planet's surface, once covered in swarm biostructures, now looked like the work of a demented artist. Organic spires had been arranged in patterns that served no strategic purpose but created images visible from orbit. Massive pictographs that told the story of the hunt in symbols any predator species would understand. Swarm corpses hung from constructed towers like trophies, their bioluminescent organs creating light shows that pulsed in rhythm with human heartbeats. "They're not just killing the swarm," Chen said quietly to Commander Zephyr, who was reviewing casualty reports with 6 arms while his remaining 2 covered his optical sensors. "They're making art out of it." The commander's translator struggled with his response, finally settling on, "The psychological profiles we're receiving from liberated worlds are unprecedented. Swarm organisms that survive initial hunter contact are displaying behaviors we've never documented. Panic. Terror. Something the xenobiologists are calling existential dread." Chan nodded grimly. The reports from across the galaxy painted a picture that no one in the galactic community had expected. The swarm, a species that had consumed entire civilizations without displaying individual consciousness, was developing personality disorders. Hive nodes were going offline not because of damage, but because the organisms inside were refusing to connect to the collective consciousness. Some bioships had been found drifting in space, their crews apparently having committed mass suicide rather than face another encounter with human hunters. "Show me the Arcturus footage," Chen commanded. The screen shifted to display orbital surveillance of a system where Chief Ironjaw's pack had encountered a swarm breeding world. The footage began normally. Swarm bioships in defensive positions around a planet covered in nursery structures designed to produce new organisms for the collective. Then the Steel Fang clan arrived. Instead of attacking the bioships, Chief Ironjaw's hunters had landed on the planet's surface and systematically hunted individual swarm organisms through their own breeding grounds. The footage showed small groups of humans moving through alien structures with the patience of born predators, tracking creatures that had never needed to hide from anything. But it was the audio that made Chen's blood run cold. The hunters were talking to each other throughout the pursuit, and their voices carried the same tone that human children used when playing games. "Got a big one heading towards Sector 7. Looks scared." "Confirmed. I can smell its fear from here. These things leak fascinating pheromones when they're terrified. This one's trying to hide. Cute. It thinks those biowalls will keep me out." The swarm organisms, for the first time in their species' history, were learning what it meant to be prey. And they were not adapting well. "The breeding world went dark after 6 hours, Zephyr reported, his voice carrying harmonics that Chen's translator interpreted as profound unease. "Not destroyed, dark. The biostructures stopped producing new organisms. The atmospheric processes shut down. The entire ecosystem just stopped." Chen studied the final frames of the footage, showing human hunters emerging from the planet's surface after what they called a pleasant afternoon's exercise. Behind them, a world that had been producing swarm organisms for millennia was silent, its biostructures wilting like plants denied sunlight. They broke it, Chen realized. Not physically, psychologically. The entire breeding population just gave up. The implications were staggering. The swarm's expansion had been halted not by military might or advanced technology, but by the simple psychological pressure of being hunted by predators who enjoyed the process. Across the galaxy, swarm organisms were displaying behaviors that xenobiologists insisted were impossible for a collective consciousness. Individual fear responses, panic disorders, and what appeared to be clinical depression. Chen's personal communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. The image that appeared was Colonel Rivera, but she looked different from the woman who had addressed the Galactic Council 6 months ago. Her scars had multiplied. Her eyes carried a predatory gleam that seemed to pierce through the screen, and her smile suggested she'd been having the time of her life. "Ambassador Chen," Rivera said without preamble, "we've found something interesting. You might want to see this." The transmission shifted to show external footage from Rivera's flagship. They were in a system Chen didn't recognize, but the local star was dimmed by what appeared to be a massive artificial structure. As the image clarified, Chen realized she was looking at the largest concentration of swarm bioships ever documented, thousands of vessels arranged in defensive formations around what could only be the swarm's primary hive. "Intelligence estimates this is their core breeding facility," Rivera continued. "The source of everything. Command nodes, breeding queens, the original consciousness that started the whole expansion. Basically, the ultimate prey." Chen felt ice forming in her veins. "Colonel, you can't be serious. That's not a target, that's a fortress. There must be 50,000 bioships in that formation." Rivera's laugh was pure predator. Ambassador, you're still thinking like civilized people. This isn't about military tactics or acceptable loss ratios. This is about the greatest hunt in galactic history. Every clan chief in human space has volunteered for this one. The screen shifted to show the human fleet assembling for what Rivera was calling the final hunt. Ships from every frontier world were represented, from the massive battlecruisers of the Steel Fang clan to the near-invisible ghost ships of the Shadow clans. But it wasn't the number of vessels that made Chen's hands tremble. It was the modifications. 6 months of hunting the swarm had changed the human fleet in ways that violated every treaty regarding weapons development. Ships that had started the war as primitive raiders now sported technology that shouldn't exist, weapon systems that seemed to bend physics, defensive measures that operated on principles galactic science couldn't explain, and sensory arrays that tracked prey through dimensions most species couldn't perceive. Where did you get those modifications? Chen asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Same place we got our tactics, Rivera replied cheerfully. Swarm bioships are full of interesting technology. We've been taking samples from every encounter, figuring out how they work, and improving on the designs. Turns out, when you're not limited by ethical considerations or safety protocols, you can make some fascinating discoveries. The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. The human hunters hadn't just been defeating the swarm, they'd been learning from it, adapting its technology, understanding its biology, and incorporating its capabilities into their own arsenal. They were becoming something new, something that combined human predatory instincts with swarm biotechnology and the resources of the galaxy's most dangerous warriors. Colonel, Chen said carefully, what exactly are you planning? Rivera's smile was the most frightening expression Chen had ever seen. We're going to end this, not by destroying the swarm. That's what civilized people would do. We're going to hunt their primary consciousness, corner it in its own fortress, and make it understand what it means to be prey. That's impossible. The primary consciousness exists across millions of organisms. You can't hunt something that doesn't have a single physical form. Watch us. The transmission ended, leaving Chen staring at a blank screen. Around her, the command center of the Galactic Fleet buzzed with activity, as officers tried to process reports from across the war zone. But every report told the same impossible story. The swarm was retreating, not just tactically withdrawing, but fleeing in panic toward their core systems. Commander Zephyr approached, his multiple arms clutching data tablets that trembled in his grip. Ambassador, we're receiving reports from 17 systems. Swarm forces are abandoning established positions and converging on the core hive. It appears they're seeking protection. Chen nodded absently, her mind processing the tactical implications. The swarm, after centuries of relentless expansion, was running home to hide from human hunters. An entire species of perfect predators was displaying the behavior patterns of frightened prey. How many human ships are participating in this final assault? She asked. Zephyr consulted his tablets, mandibles clicking with distress. Unknown. Our monitoring stations report new vessels arriving daily from systems we weren't aware contained human populations. The current count exceeds 10,000 vessels, but the number keeps growing. 10,000 ships carrying humanity's finest predators, all converging on the greatest hunt in galactic history. Chen tried to imagine what that would look like, not just the tactical implications, but the psychological impact of 10,000 apex predators focused on a single prey species. The answer came 3 days later, when the human fleet reached the swarm's primary hive. The initial footage was captured by long-range sensors positioned at the edge of the system. What they recorded would be studied by xenobiologists and military strategists for generations, not as an example of space combat, but as documentation of something that had never happened before in galactic history. The moment when a collective consciousness experienced individual terror. The human fleet didn't attack the swarm's defensive formations. Instead, they scattered throughout the system like a pack of wolves surrounding cornered prey. Ships took positions near planets, asteroid fields, and stellar phenomena, creating a perimeter that nothing could cross undetected. Then they waited. For 6 hours, the standoff continued. The swarm bioships maintained their defensive positions around the primary hive, while human vessels held their perimeter. No shots were fired, no communications exchanged. It was, as Chief Bloodhawk would later describe it, the moment before the pounce. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Swarm organisms throughout the galaxy began displaying panic responses as their collective consciousness felt itself surrounded by predators for the first time in its existence. Bioships and distant systems stopped functioning as their crews lost connection to the primary nodes. Entire swarm colonies went dormant as organisms retreated into catatonic states. The breakthrough came when the swarm made a fatal mistake. They tried to communicate. The message was broadcast across all frequencies, translated through every known linguistic matrix, and carried emotional harmonics that made even hardened military personnel step away from their communication arrays. It was the voice of a collective consciousness experiencing individual fear for the first time. Why do you hunt us? We offer no challenge. We threaten nothing you value. We seek only to exist. Colonel Rivera's response was broadcast on the same frequencies, but her voice carried something the swarm had never encountered before: the joy of a predator addressing worthy prey. You consume 17 civilizations, billions of individual minds, each with hopes, dreams, fears, and loves. You turned thinking beings into biomass because it was efficient. You never asked why they wanted to live. You never considered their terror as you consumed them. Now you know what that feels like. The swarm's reply came immediately, tinged with something that could only be described as desperation. We did not understand. We will withdraw. We will cease expansion. We seek only survival. Rivera's laugh echoed across hyperspace. Too late for that. You taught the galaxy that some things are too dangerous to let live. Time for you to learn that some things are too dangerous to run from. What followed was not a battle, but an execution carried out with the precision and artistry that only apex predators could achieve. The human fleet moved inward, not in formation but as individuals, each hunter following their own instincts and methodology. Some attacked directly, using weapons that tore through swarm bioships like tissue paper. Others infiltrated vessels, turning the swarm's own biotechnology against itself. The ghost clans phased through defensive barriers that had never been designed to stop beings who could exist between dimensions. But the most devastating attacks came from hunters who had learned to target the collective consciousness directly. Using technology adapted from swarm neural networks, they began severing the connections between individual organisms and the primary hive. For the first time in their existence, swarm beings found themselves alone in their own minds. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Organisms that had never existed as individuals suddenly experienced isolation, fear, and mortality. The collective consciousness, feeling pieces of itself being surgically removed by predators that understood its biology better than it did, began to fragment. Chen watched the footage from the Galactic Command Station, her hands gripping the observation rail so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The screen showed the interior of a swarm bioship where human hunters were systematically severing neural connections with tools that looked like they'd been crafted by artists rather than warriors. The hunters weren't just killing swarm organisms, they were performing surgery on a collective consciousness, cutting out individual pieces and forcing them to experience existence as separate beings. It was psychological warfare on a scale that had never been attempted before. The primary hive structure is beginning to collapse, reported Zephyr, his voice carrying harmonics of awe and horror, not physically, structurally. The collective consciousness is fragmenting into individual components. They're becoming separate. Chen watched as thousands of years of collective evolution were reversed in hours. The swarm's primary advantage, their perfect unity and shared consciousness, was being systematically dismantled by predators who understood that the greatest victory over a collective species was to force them to experience individuality. The final phase of the hunt began when the primary consciousness made one last desperate attempt to survive. Every swarm organism in the galaxy suddenly began converging on the core hive, abandoning positions and operations that had taken centuries to establish. They were trying to physically merge into a single superorganism that could resist the hunter's psychological attacks. It was exactly what Rivera had been waiting for. All clans, this is the Colonel. They're grouping up. Perfect. Time to show them what happens when prey tries to hide in the den. The human fleet converged on the core hive as the swarm organisms attempted their merger. But instead of trying to prevent the process, the hunters facilitated it. They guided fleeing bioships toward the primary structure, herded scattered organisms into the growing mass, and eliminated any swarm forces that tried to escape the convergence. Within hours, every swarm organism in the galaxy was compressed into a single massive biostructure orbiting the core system's primary star. It was the largest living construct ever created, a fusion of millions of individual organisms into one collective being. It was also the perfect target. Rivera's final transmission was broadcast to every inhabited system in the galaxy. This is Colonel Rivera to all galactic forces. The swarm has been contained to a single location. Recommend all civilized vessels withdraw to minimum safe distance. The hunters are going in for the kill. What followed was not warfare, but art. The human fleet approached the massive biostructure not as conquerors, but as predators, savoring the final moments of a hunt that had consumed 6 months of their lives. They began their final attack with the patience and precision of apex predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The assault lasted 18 hours. Not because the swarm was difficult to kill, but because the hunters wanted to savor every moment. They dismantled the biostructure piece by piece, layer by layer, giving the collective consciousness time to feel each section being severed. They used techniques that maximized psychological impact, ensuring that the dying superorganism experienced every form of fear, despair, and isolation that individual consciousness could provide. When it was over, the core system contained only debris and the scattered remains of what had once been the galaxy's most feared predator species. The swarm was extinct, not just physically but conceptually. The collective consciousness that had driven their expansion for millennia had been forced to experience individual death millions of times over. The hunters had achieved something that military historians would struggle to categorize. They had committed genocide against a species by teaching it how to die as individuals. Colonel Rivera's final report to the Galactic Council was brief. Threat eliminated. Returning to frontier worlds. Send payment to the usual accounts. The aftermath of the final hunt changed the galaxy in ways that no one had anticipated. The swarm's extinction left vast regions of space empty and available for colonization. But few species were eager to expand into territories that had been cleared by human predators. More importantly, the galactic community had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about their human neighbors. The polite diplomats and competent scientists who represented humanity in civilized space were not representative of the species as a whole. Somewhere out there, in systems that appeared on no galactic charts, lived humans who considered the extinction of an entire species a moderately entertaining way to spend 6 months. Ambassador Chen stood once again in the council chamber where the decision to recruit human hunters had been made. The same delegates who had voted to unleash humanity's predators now sat in uncomfortable silence, processing reports of worlds where human hunting parties had decided to stay after the war ended. The frontier worlds are expanding, Chen announced to the assembled representatives. 7 new systems have been claimed by various clans. They're using swarm biotechnology to terraform worlds that were previously uninhabitable. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The humans hadn't just defeated the swarm, they had absorbed its technology, learned its secrets, and were now using its capabilities to expand into territories that no civilized species could survive in. General Thractos raised a scaled claw. Are we to understand that the human hunters now possess swarm capabilities, bioships, adaptive technology, neural networking? Chen's smile was diplomatically neutral, but her eyes carried something that reminded the general of Colonel Rivera's predatory gleam. Let's just say that humanity's definition of civilized space has expanded significantly. The frontier worlds are no longer limited by conventional technology or traditional territorial boundaries. High Speaker Molak's keen nose detected stress pheromones from representatives throughout the chamber. Ambassador Chen, the Council needs assurance that these human hunters will remain in their designated territories. The galaxy cannot survive another predator species with unlimited expansion capabilities. Chen's response was delivered with the same diplomatic courtesy she'd maintained for 3 centuries of service, but every representative in the chamber understood the threat beneath her words. High Speaker, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. The galaxy asked humanity to save it from an existential threat. We did. The fact that we enjoyed the process and learned from our prey is simply human nature. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. The frontier worlds have no interest in conquering civilized space. You're not challenging enough to be interesting prey. But I would respectfully suggest that the galactic community remember this lesson. When you ask predators to solve your problems, you need to be very careful about what you're willing to let them become. The session ended in uncomfortable silence. Outside the chamber, representatives huddled in small groups, whispering about defense budgets and territorial agreements. But the real conversations were happening in private communications, as species began quietly negotiating with human frontier representatives to ensure they would never be considered prey. 6 months later, the first reports began arriving of swarm biotechnology being used for peaceful purposes in human space. Worlds that had been barren rock were transformed into garden paradises in weeks. Space habitats that could support millions of inhabitants were grown like plants. Ships that could travel between galaxies were being crafted in orbital bioforges that sang with alien harmonies. The galaxy had been saved from the swarm, but it was slowly realizing that it might have traded one apex predator for something even more dangerous: Apex predators with unlimited adaptive capabilities and a proven ability to eliminate any threat through methods that civilized minds could barely comprehend. In the depths of frontier world space, Colonel Rivera stood on the observation deck of a bioship that had been grown rather than built, watching new worlds take shape under the guidance of human hunters who had learned to create as efficiently as they destroyed. The hunt was over, and they were no longer limited by the primitive technologies and territorial boundaries that had defined humanity's place in the galaxy. They had become something new. Something that combined human predatory instincts with the absorbed capabilities of every prey species they had encountered. The galaxy had asked for fighters when it needed them. What it got was evolution itself, wearing a human face and carrying weapons that shouldn't exist. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, new hunters were being born who would never know a galaxy where humanity was considered harmless, average, or containable. The age of human expansion was about to begin, and the galaxy was finally beginning to understand why evolution had produced a species that hunted for pleasure rather than necessity. Because sometimes, the universe needed predators who could become whatever the hunt required them to be.